How are you is one of the most commonly used phrases in the English language. We use this phrase so much that very seldom, if ever, do you actually stop to think about what we're saying, let alone the history of this phrase. Today, I'm going to share with you the untold story of how are you and how understanding it has forever changed my life and has the potential to change yours as well. The story of how are you starts at my workplace. I work at Sears ThinkBox. At 50,000 square feet and 7 floors, it is the largest open access innovation center at any university in the world. And with such technology and opportunity comes a lot of nerves. Maybe you've never used a 3D printer before in your life. I really don't want to break this laser cutter. So for me, one of the most important roles I have at my job is simply greeting people at the front desk. At this post, this is my first line of defense against any of the barriers to access that people face when they come into the space. Now, my general spiel is, hi, welcome to ThinkBox, how are you today? Hi, welcome to ThinkBox, how can I help you get started? Whoop. And one day this February, I started with that same spiel. Hi, welcome to ThinkBox, but I had to stop. I noticed that the person entering the space was one of my coworkers. He was coming in to replace me at the front desk during a shift change, but something was off. My coworker entered the space crying hysterically. And in that moment, the only thing I knew what to do was to say, is everything okay? Is it an emergency? How can I help you in this moment? And he said, you know, it's not an emergency. I'll be fine. I just need 10 minutes to myself to get myself together. And he stepped away to the restroom. And during that point, I sat there thinking, what could be going on? This is the 3rd week of the semester. I've only worked 2 shifts with this person. I don't know where he's from. I don't know his major. The extent of our interactions is, hey, how are you? I'm good, thanks. And we just do our work and continue. So after about 10 minutes, my coworker came back. We sat down and I said, look, if you need to talk about it, I'm here for you if you're comfortable sharing. But before he could start really getting into the crux of what was going on, something happened. Somebody walked past the front desk, didn't look at either of us, and said, hey, how are you? And walked out. And in this moment, we both looked at each other. We were very confused and hurt. How could you say, how are you, to someone who's actively crying and clearly not okay? That answer is not going to be good. It's not going to be fine. There's not enough time to actually gauge what is going on. And for me, that confusion quickly turned to anger. How could you completely and blatantly disregard someone's humanity like that? And before I could get up to speak to that person, before I could walk out to do something about it, my coworker sitting next to me, still crying, said, I'm fine, thanks, and retreated. Seeing that disagreement between speech and sentiment rocked my soul to the core. It made me start questioning this phrase, how are you? This greeting, is it a greeting? Is it a question? Do we really care about what we're saying when we're saying it? It brought me to this stage today. Now, this is a very extreme example of what can go wrong when we misuse the phrase, how are you? But here are some common examples that I'll act out for you right now. Exhibit A. Hey, how are you? Internally, I'm so tired. I'm hungry. I think I may have failed my chemistry midterm. Externally, I'm good, thanks, how are you? Sometimes we're not being honest about our condition. And this is one of my favorite tweets ever. Here's a second example, Exhibit B. Hey, how's it going? Oh my God, it's the best day ever. I have a medical school interview coming up at my top school. I'm giving a TED Talk on Saturday. It's gonna be my mom's birthday. Happy birthday, Mom, row 3, aisle 2. But before you can actually tell the person completely what's going on, they've retreated. They simply don't have enough time to hear what you're saying. Or it could be a matter of, whoa, that's too much information. I don't wanna hear any of that. So, how did we get to this culture of I'm good, I'm fine, and hearing anything beyond that becomes unacceptable? Was "how are you" always an empty greeting, or was it really a question at some point? Quite frankly, it used to be a question. As early as the 14th century, we see derivatives of the phrase "how are you" written in American English. How do you do in blank? What's important about this "how do you do" phrase is that it was understood by most people that the context was health specifically. So if someone said, "How do you do?" you'd reply, "I'm well, thanks," or "I have a cough, I have a fever." And when the questioner wanted access to information in a different realm of that person's life, there would be this ending qualifier phrase in something, in business, in family, in education. And these qualifiers were what's very important about using this phrase. The person who was asking that question, maybe you don't want too much information. You pre-filtered it before you even asked. And for the person answering the question, you had a specific context to place yourself in. You didn't think about things that were going on in this place or that place. You had that context pre-given to you. And these ending qualifiers continued to the 16th century. How do you fare was the most commonly used derivative at the time, and honestly my favorite in this history. Do you know how we say farewell when we're trying to be extra when we say bye to people? It actually referred to the phrase, "how do you fare?" Fare being that person's condition at that time. It was a verb. We used to wish people well when they departed. It was a real thing and not a bougie greeting, I know. So the real distinguishing factor in the history of "how are you" is the mid-18th century. And that's where this phrase that we use today actually came from. What's interesting here, you notice that these ending qualifiers are actually lost. What was most interesting to me learning this, concurrently in the mid-18th century, we have nothing but the Industrial Revolution. So our conversations became less about how do you fare in health and how's business, turn to how's business going. How do you fare in business? How is business? And over time, that in business became integrated with you. How's business? Things are great, things are booming. How are you? I'm good, I'm good. And that leads us into the modern times, the 20th century, 21st century. Hey, what's poppin'? What's crackin'? What's crack-a-lackin'? These are all derivatives of that 14th century "how do you do?" but with the absence of these ending qualifiers to place context in this interaction. Now, this is important. The real meaning of "how are you" has actually changed because of the absence of these ending qualifiers on the phrase. What once was a question of sincere state, how are you doing in this moment, in this context, has now become a question of existence, of psychology and philosophy that takes real time to process. Psychologist Eugene Gendlin placed this so beautifully in the 1970s in one of his works. And just to briefly summarize what he's saying, if we truly want to answer "how are you" honestly and completely, we need to do three things. The first, recognize how we're feeling. And for most of us, that's pretty easy to do. How are you doing right now? You know, I'm a little bit hungry. All right, step number one. Step number two, how things are going for us right now. I'm a little bit hungry, but I need to give my TED talk. All right, keep going. The situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. I'm a little hungry, I need to give my TED talk, but I'm gonna have to compromise to wait to eat after so I don't throw up from all the nerves that I have right now. This requires so much thought and contextualization that is very hard to do in passing when we throw the phrase "how are you" out. We simply don't have enough time to do that processing. And it's especially difficult to do that processing when you're actively crying and can't even speak for yourself in the moment. Now, at a university where our motto is "think beyond the possible," sometimes we have to place aside how we're actually doing. So when someone asks me how I'm doing on the quad, it kind of shocks me, especially after considering this process and learning all of these things. When someone asks me how I'm doing, I might jump to all the things that are going wrong in my life with the absence of this context. So when we just throw this greeting out, it can really place us into kind of these anxiety spirals, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So how are we going to prevent all of this? What are we going to do? Are we going to stop saying "how are you"? Are we going to start saying "how do you fare"? What's going to happen? Here's an idea. Let's bring "how are you" back to its original meaning. And that was a sincere question. with a contextualized intention and an acknowledgement of the amount of time that was available for the discussion. So why would we do that? That's so 1600. I'm not going to say, how do you fare? What are you talking about? What do we have to lose? Number one, these existential crises. When you're walking down the quad and someone slaps you with the how are you, you're not going to think about where your position is in life and things like that. Number two, TMI incidents. If we can use these contextualized intentions again, we'll pre-filter that information that we want. So we won't be exposed to all of those things that we might not want to delve into. Number three, which is the most important for me, is the pressure to be okay 24/7. So again, we're thinking beyond the possible, but there's a problem here. Sometimes there's a limit to human capability. We are not machines. This is not the Industrial Revolution. There are going to be times when we need someone to talk to. There are going to be times when we need to take a break. It is okay to not be okay. I'm going to say it one more time. It is okay to not be okay. Now, I want to ask you a favor, and it's going to be really difficult. I need you to turn to the person to your right, and I want you to say, it is okay to not be okay. Can you do that for me? It's okay to not be okay. All right. Now, to the left, to the left. All right. Give yourselves a round of applause, because I know just how hard that was for you to do. I personally know how hard that is to do, so thank you for your participation. All right, so the flip side. What do we actually have to gain here? Number one, honest answers. If we are sincere and intentional in the way that we're asking this question, we'll actually start to get real answers in return. Real answers that give us information that can help us to work better with people in the future and just contextualize where we are. It'll give us community awareness. That barista that makes your coffee every morning, the person that you work with that you don't necessarily talk to, if we can start asking these simple questions, we'll be able to gain information about things that we normally would pass by every day, just by not using this phrase to its full potential. Which brings us to safe spaces. If you're sharing these small tidbits of information with those around you, we'll have more of a sense of community. So maybe the barista knows that I have a few exams going on, so when I walk in the next morning stressed, she can identify, hey, is this because of what you have going on? We'll be able to share amongst one another the circumstances that we have going on. And in this way, we'll have safe spaces, places to go to in those moments of stress. We don't have to suffer in silence, and changing how are you back to this original meeting will help us get there. And lastly, collaboration, which I'll expand on in a few minutes. But what all of these ideas lead up to is an idea that's really big and honestly really scary, and we don't want to address it or talk about it. It is the idea of mutual understanding. Mutual understanding is the idea that maybe the person next to me, my neighbor, my classmate, my coworker, who's nothing like me, maybe we actually have so much in common. Maybe we're going through the same things at this moment. Mutual understanding is an idea that can disrupt all of the isms and the phobias that so much divide us. When we reach mutual understanding, we will reach this point where we recognize that we're all humans traveling through this journey of life together, and we're not that much different from one another. And that idea is very big and very scary. And it's going to require a lot of work. But as Case Western, as a community, as a world, I think we're worth that work. So how are we going to get there? How are we going to bring How Are You back to its real meaning? We have 3 problems here, and I propose 3 potential solutions. Number 1, sincerity. Sometimes we're just not being honest, people asking and answering. Sometimes we have so much going on that we really can't hear how someone is doing. We don't even know how we're doing ourselves, and we need to acknowledge that before we start using this phrase. The second thing is intentionality. We just throw out, hey, how are you? Even when we want to know how someone is doing, we're not using this phrase to the best of its ability. We could be using these contexts at the end to really get that true information. And the third thing is time. Sometimes in passing, we just really don't have time to hear everything. So we need a way to get these small tidbits of information a little bit better. Or when we do have the time, be prepared to hear the whole story. 3 solutions. Here's one, off rip. If you don't want to know how someone is doing, you don't have to ask. Wow, yeah? You don't have to ask. That's crazy, wow. Hear me out. What I'm saying is, we can use alternative greetings. We just say, hey, how are you? Good, thanks, and walk away. But that's really ineffective. We could say, I hope you have an awesome weekend. Have a rockin' Thursday. Enjoy the movie tonight. We can wish well to people without actually saying, how are you? There are so many other greetings in American English. And number 2, which is really gearing back to bringing how are you to its original meaning, and that's using more specific questions. How was your first class this morning? How was your weekend? How is that party that you're planning? In this way, we can get this information without the TMI incidents and without putting us into the spiraling existential crisis bubble. And the third thing, which is the most difficult, and what I challenge each and every one of you to do, is to ask someone, how are you, and how are you really, and be prepared to hear the whole story. So going back to the story that I mentioned at the beginning. After that person walked past the desk, Spencer, my coworker, and I just sat there very confused. And I broke that silence. I said, Spencer, I'm so sorry. And he's like, no, it's fine, it's okay. And I said, you know, it's really not. How are you and how are you really? I don't care how long I need to sit here, but I just need to make sure that you're okay. You can't work in this condition. We sat and spoke for 2 hours, and I learned that Spencer was really going through it. He had a family member back home that was sick. He had 3 major projects coming up for school. He is a game design major. He's going to a conference for game designing pretty soon. And considering all these factors going on in his life, he's feeling very anxious right now. Now, you might be a person who sees all of these things as problems. Man, those are issues. I don't want to hear about other people's problems. I have my own. But perspective is so important. We can choose to view these things as problems or as information, as solutions to potential problems. And that's how I chose to view the situation. So what did I do? I learned that Spencer is so great at game design, but graphic design is not his passion, even though he's so great at it. And for that reason, Spencer will prioritize his game design projects over those other ones that aren't as important. I learned that he's from Northeast Ohio. I'm from Cleveland. I love my Northeast Ohioans. Represent. I also learned that when he's anxious, giving tours might not be the best thing. And from this one question, one sincere interaction, working with Spencer throughout the rest of the semester became such a breeze. I could walk in the space, just look him in the eye, and know that today I was giving that tour. From a short conversation, he would know that he was to make the flyer for the event coming up. In a way, it became kind of a game. In the sense, I'd say, hey, Spencer, how are you? He'd say, good, and I'd look at him like, but really, how are you? And we developed this expectation of one another to really answer the question honestly and bring it back to its original meaning. Spencer became a very good friend of mine, and he was a person that, honestly, I think I would have never crossed paths with in life had I not just asked this question. So Spencer, if you're here in the audience today, or when you're watching this, I just want to say thank you. You sharing this traumatic experience with me and just being so vulnerable and honest has truly changed the way that I view this phrase and has changed communication and all of my friendships as a whole, so I thank you. The other day at work, I actually found Spencer's name tag, and it just made me reflect about this whole experience. He's since graduated and moved on from Case, but this interaction, this untold story, and everything about it is still so relevant to me. So friends and family, if in the past few months you've asked me, hey, how are you? And I haven't replied, it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's not because I don't hear you. It's because I think we're better than that. If you've asked me, hey, how are you? And I've said, you know, I'm just trying to graduate today. That's how I really felt in the moment. And if you've noticed that I haven't asked you, how are you, in a general context, it's because I think we're worth that mutual understanding. We can bring how are you back to its original meaning to truly tap into communication in our communities and those around us like we never had before. The story of how are you is a story of how Spencer and Nichola, two people from completely different worlds, became very good friends. The story of how are you is one of a lost context, of a lost history, but it's also a story of overwhelming potential to maximize communication and interactions that happen all the time, just make them so much better. It's a story of community, of mutual understanding. It is a story that so desperately needs a new chapter to be written. And I hope this is a chapter that each and every one of us can play a role in writing. Thank you.